At first, no one thought it was a crime. It began with something ordinary. Two young girls ate raspberries. Not from the street. Not from a suspicious source. Just fruit, something harmless, something familiar. Within hours, both girls became seriously ill. The symptoms were severe enough that they were rushed for medical treatment. Doctors initially treated it as food poisoning. But as tests came back, one thing became clear. This was not contaminated. It was deliberate poisoning. The raspberries the girls had eaten contained a toxic substance, something that should never have been there. Once that conclusion was reached, the situation changed immediately. This was no longer a medical emergency. It was a criminal investigation. Authorities moved quickly to determine how poison ended up in the fruit and who had access to it. Food poisoning cases are common. Poisoning cases are not. They require intent. And intent means someone made a decision long before the girls ever took a bite. At this stage, investigators did not name a suspect. They focused on the raspberries. This is the case of Zulma Guzman Castro. A case that began with something sweet and ordinary, and ended with questions that would expose intent, calculation, and a choice that could never be undone. Before anyone understood who she was or why she did what she did, two children had already paid the price. Where they came from. Who prepared them? Who handled them last? There were no witnesses. No obvious crime scene. No immediate explanation that made sense. Just two children harmed by something that should have been safe. And a growing realization that whoever was responsible had acted quietly, without force, without confrontation, and without being noticed. By the end of that first day, authorities knew one thing for certain. This was not an accident. And whoever had done this had already disappeared into the background of everyday life. Once authorities confirmed the raspberries had been deliberately poisoned, the case shifted immediately. Medical teams focused on stabilizing the two girls. Investigators focused on intent. Poisoning is treated differently from most crimes. There is no struggle to reconstruct. No weapon to recover from a scene. No forced entry. Instead, everything depends on access. Who touched the food? Who prepared it? Who had the opportunity to alter it without being seen? Investigators began tracing the raspberries backward, where they were obtained, how they were stored, who had possession of them before they were eaten. Every step mattered, because in cases like this, the poison does not travel on its own. Someone has to place it there. As news of the poisoning spread, concern grew beyond the immediate family. Parents wanted answers. Authorities issued warnings. The possibility of wider risk had to be ruled out. This was no longer just about two victims. It was about public safety. At this stage, police still did not make an arrest. There was no suspect in custody. No public accusation. That absence created uncertainty. The crime was serious, but invisible. Nothing about the situation explained why the girls were targeted, or how the poison was introduced without detection. And then, another problem emerged. The person investigators wanted to question was no longer easy to locate. As authorities worked to piece together the timeline, they discovered that a key individual connected to the case had left the country. That fact alone did not prove wrongdoing. But it changed the investigation. What had begun as a local criminal inquiry was now moving in a different direction. One that would soon involve multiple countries, international coordination, and a search that would last far longer than anyone expected. And for investigators, the concern was no longer just what had happened to the girls. It was whether the person responsible believed they had already gotten away with it. By this point, investigators understood what had happened. Two children had been poisoned. The raspberries were the delivery method. The act was intentional. What they did not understand was why. And that uncertainty shaped everything that followed. The first question was access. Who had handled the raspberries before the girls ate them? Poisoning requires opportunity, not strength, not speed. Someone had to be close enough, trusted enough, and unnoticed enough to alter the food without raising alarm. That immediately narrowed the field. The second question was targeting. Were the girls chosen specifically? Or were they victims of convenience? Poisoning suggests planning, but not always a clear motive. Investigators needed to know whether this was a personal act or something broader, and at this stage, there was no answer. Then came the question of timing. When exactly was the poison introduced? Before the fruit entered the home? Or afterward? That distinction mattered, because it determined whether the crime involved one moment of opportunity or a longer period of preparation. Another question followed closely behind. Why poison? Poisoning is indirect. It avoids confrontation, it avoids witnesses, and it often delays discovery. Whoever chose this method likely expected the illness to look accidental at first. And in this case, it did. The final question was the most troubling. If this poisoning had been discovered slightly later, if doctors had not tested the raspberries, would this ever have been identified as a crime at all? Because the difference between food poisoning and criminal poisoning is not always obvious. And in those early hours, the case balanced dangerously close to being explained away. Investigators were now racing against two things: time, and the possibility that the person responsible had already put distance between themselves and the crime. At this stage, the case had facts, but it did not yet have clarity. And without clarity, the crime still had room to hide. Once investigators confirmed that the poisoning was deliberate, the focus shifted to reconstruction. Not of a struggle, but of a sequence. Poisoning cases rarely offer a clear crime scene. There were no signs of forced entry. No witnesses who saw anything unusual. No immediate physical link between the act and the person who carried it out. Instead, investigators had to rely on movement and access. They began by documenting everyone who had contact with the raspberries. Who bought them? Who stored them? Who handled them before they were eaten? Each step was examined carefully, because in cases like this, the smallest detail can determine intent. Forensic teams analyzed the raspberries themselves. They needed to identify the toxic substance used, how it was introduced, and whether it could have entered the fruit accidentally. The conclusion remained consistent. This was not contamination from farming or transport. It had been added intentionally. That finding narrowed the investigation, but not enough. Investigators also reviewed the timeline of the girl's illness. When symptoms began, how quickly they escalated, what that suggested about the dosage. This mattered because it helped determine when the poison was introduced. But even with that information, the picture was incomplete. Poison does not leave fingerprints the way a weapon does. It doesn't announce itself, and the person responsible does not need to be present when the harm occurs. That makes early intervention difficult. As police worked through interviews, one issue became clear. There was no immediate confession. No obvious suspect willing to speak freely. And the person investigators most wanted to question was no longer in the country. Authorities confirmed that Zulma Guzman Castro, a Colombian businesswoman connected to the case, had left Colombia shortly after the incident. At that moment, investigators did not publicly accuse her. Leaving a country is not a crime. But it complicated the investigation. It meant interviews would require cooperation across borders. It meant timelines would have to be reconstructed without direct access. And it meant that whatever explanation might exist would now be delayed. The case slowed not because investigators stopped working, but because poisoning cases demand certainty. Charging someone requires more than suspicion. It requires proof that a specific person introduced the poison knowingly and intentionally. And at this stage, That proof was still being built. The crime had been identified. But the path to accountability was far from clear. And as days passed, investigators had to confront an uncomfortable reality. The longer the delay, the easier it would be for the person responsible to disappear completely. As the investigation continued, police began narrowing their focus. Not because of a single piece of evidence, but because of access. Investigators reviewed who had direct contact with the raspberries before the girls ate them. They also reviewed who had the opportunity to handle the fruit without raising suspicion. That process led them repeatedly to one name: Zulma Guzman Castro. According to authorities, Zulma was a Colombian businesswoman with a connection to the children and access to the food. At this stage, investigators did not publicly accuse her of wrongdoing. They described her as a person of interest. That distinction mattered, because suspicion in a poisoning case must be supported by more than proximity. Police examined communication records, timelines, and movements. They looked at where Zulma had been before and after the poisoning, and they noted something important. Shortly after the incident, she left the country. Again, this did not establish guilt. But it raised urgency. Investigators needed to question her directly. They needed explanations. They needed to understand her movements during a very narrow window of time. Without her cooperation, the investigation stalled. Authorities attempted to locate her through standard channels. When that failed, the case escalated. What had begun as a domestic criminal inquiry now involved international law enforcement coordination. At this point, the public still knew very little. There were no press conferences naming a suspect. No public statements accusing Zulma Guzman Castro of poisoning. But behind the scenes, investigators were preparing for a different phase of the case. One that no longer assumed the suspect would remain within reach. Because once someone crosses borders, every unanswered question becomes harder to resolve. And the longer a suspect remains out of reach, the easier it becomes for a crime like this to remain unresolved. By the time investigators were ready to formally question Zulma Guzman Castro, she was no longer in Colombia. Authorities confirmed that she had left the country shortly after the poisoning incident. Where she went initially was unclear. There was no public record of her movements beyond standard travel data. No indication that she was attempting to contact investigators. No sign that she intended to return voluntarily. At this stage, the case changed shape. When a suspect is inside a country, law enforcement controls the timeline. Once that person crosses borders, the timeline no longer belongs to one authority. Investigators began coordinating with international partners. Travel records were reviewed. Border movements were flagged. Alerts were issued through international law enforcement channels. This was no longer just about establishing what had happened. It was about locating someone who might never intend to explain themselves. Despite these efforts, days turned into weeks with no public breakthrough. There were no sightings. No confirmed addresses. No direct communication. For investigators, this presented a serious challenge. Poisoning cases rely heavily on explanation. Intent must be proven. Opportunity must be tied to action. And the suspect's own account often becomes critical. Without access to Zulma Guzman Castro, that final piece was missing. The disappearance also complicated public perception. Authorities were careful with their language. They did not label her a fugitive. They did not announce a manhunt. But internally, the urgency had increased. Every delay raised the risk that evidence would degrade, memories would fade, and the trail would grow colder. And in cases involving poisoning, time is rarely an ally. Because the crime itself leaves so little behind. As investigators worked quietly across borders, one thing became increasingly clear. If Zulma Guzman Castro was found, it would not be because she stepped forward. It would be because the search reached her first. As the search expanded beyond Colombia, the investigation entered a slower, more complex phase. International cases move differently. Each request for information has to pass through multiple agencies. Each lead has to be verified across systems that do not always communicate easily. Investigators relied on travel records, border data, and financial activity to trace Zulma Guzman Castro's movements. There were no confirmed sightings made public. No social media trail investigators could rely on. What they did know was that she was no longer in Latin America. Attention gradually shifted to Europe. UK authorities were notified as part of standard international coordination, and information was shared through formal law enforcement channels. Still, the search remained quiet. There were no press appeals asking the public to help locate her. No release of images labeling her a wanted fugitive. This was deliberate. Investigators did not want to alert her if she was attempting to stay unnoticed. Poisoning cases depend on containment. If a suspect realizes they are being actively sought, they may take steps to disappear further. So the search continued quietly. Behind the scenes, movements were monitored where possible. Locations were narrowed based on confirmed travel patterns rather than rumor. Weeks passed without resolution. For investigators, this was a familiar problem. The crime itself had been subtle. Now, the search was subtle too. But subtlety carries risk. The longer a suspect remains unlocated, the harder it becomes to bring a case to court. And yet, investigators pressed on, because cases like this rarely end with a dramatic arrest. They end when pressure, time, and circumstance intersect. And in this case, that intersection was approaching. The search for Zulma Guzman Castro did not end with an arrest. It ended with an emergency call. UK authorities confirmed that she was located in London, near the River Thames. What happened next was not part of any investigative plan. Zulma Guzman Castro entered the river. Emergency services were dispatched immediately. This was not treated as a police operation. It was treated as a rescue. Fire crews and emergency responders pulled her from the water alive. She was taken into medical care before being placed into custody. The moment was brief. There was no public chase. No confrontation. No attempt to flee through crowds. Just a sudden collapse of the distance she had maintained for weeks. For investigators, this moment changed everything. Zulma Guzman Castro was no longer missing. She was no longer out of reach. The international search was over, but the legal process was only beginning. Authorities were careful in their public statements. They did not speculate on her intentions. They did not frame the incident as an admission of guilt. They confirmed only what could be verified. She had been located. She had entered the river. She had been rescued. And she was now in custody. What had started as a poisoning investigation in Colombia had ended this phase of the story thousands of miles away, under circumstances no one could have predicted. The case had moved from uncertainty to containment. But the most difficult part still remained. Because locating a suspect is not the same as proving a crime. And in poisoning cases, proof depends not on drama, but on details. Details investigators would now have to examine under the scrutiny of courts, not headlines. With Zulma Guzman Castro now in custody, the focus returned to the crime itself. And that's when the questions became harder to ignore. The first issue was timing. Poisoning cases depend on precision not just in how a substance is introduced, but in when. Investigators had to determine exactly when the raspberries were altered. That window was narrow, which meant access had been limited. But proving access is not the same as proving action. Another issue was visibility. No one had seen anything unusual. No one reported suspicious behavior around the food. There were no witnesses who could say when the poison was added. That absence mattered. Because crimes that rely on secrecy often leave investigators with circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof. Then there was the question of motive. Public reporting did not identify a clear reason for why the girls would be targeted. There was no robbery, no confrontation, no obvious escalation. That lack of visible motive complicated the case. Jurors expect a reason even when the law does not require one. Investigators also had to consider how close the case came to being misclassified. If the raspberries had not been tested, if the illness had been attributed solely to contamination, if symptoms had progressed differently, this might never have been treated as a crime. That realization forced a broader question. How many similar incidents are explained away because they look ordinary? Food poisoning happens every day. Deliberate poisoning does not. The difference between the two can be a single test, ordered at the right moment. As authorities reviewed the evidence, the case highlighted a fragile truth. The crime didn't rely on force. It didn't rely on speed. It relied on assumption. Assumption that food is safe. Assumption that illness is natural. Assumption that harm must look violent to be intentional. Those assumptions nearly allowed the crime to disappear. And even now, with a suspect located, the hardest work remained. With Zulma Guzman Castro in custody, the case entered a new phase. Not investigative. Legal. At this stage, the focus shifted from what happened to what could be proven. Authorities confirmed that she was being held while legal procedures were initiated. Because the alleged crime occurred outside the United Kingdom, the process was not straightforward. Jurisdiction mattered. Colombian authorities were responsible for the investigation. UK authorities were responsible for custody and legal cooperation. That meant extradition. Extradition is not automatic. It requires formal requests, documentation, and judicial review. Prosecutors must demonstrate that a crime was committed. The suspect is connected to that crime. And the legal standards of both countries are met. At this point, public reporting made one thing clear. Zulma Guzman Castro had not been convicted. She had not entered a plea. And the case was still unfolding. Authorities were careful with language. They referred to allegations. They emphasized due process. They avoided conclusions. That restraint mattered. Because poisoning cases often hinge on expert testimony to explain toxicology, dosage, timing, and intent. None of that happens quickly. Medical evidence must be reviewed. Forensic findings must be challenged. Chain of custody must be established. Every step is examined, and the defense has the right to contest all of it. This is where many poisoning cases falter. Not because the act didn't happen, but because proving who introduced the poison, and when, is legally complex. As the legal process moved forward, the case remained under scrutiny. Not just by courts, but by the public. Because this was no longer just a story about poisoned fruit. It was a case about how easily harm can be concealed, and how much certainty the justice system requires before it acts. The outcome was no longer in the hands of investigators. It was now in the hands of the law. As the legal process moved forward, the immediate focus remained on the two victims. Public reporting emphasized that both girls survived the poisoning, but the incident left lasting effects. Medical recovery did not end when they left the hospital. Poisoning cases often involve ongoing monitoring, follow-up treatment, and long-term uncertainty about health outcomes. For their families, life did not return to normal. Every routine involving food changed. Every shared meal carried hesitation. What had once been automatic now required thought. Beyond the families, the case raised broader concerns. Food safety incidents are typically addressed through recalls and inspections. This case was different. It demonstrated how intentional harm can move through ordinary systems undetected. Authorities emphasize that deliberate poisoning is rare, but when it occurs, it challenges assumptions about safety and trust. The case also highlighted the limitations of early detection. Had medical staff not tested the raspberries, The illness could have been classified differently. That realization prompted discussion among professionals about when to escalate suspected food-related illness into criminal inquiry. For investigators, the case served as a reminder of how difficult poisoning cases are to resolve. They require medical expertise, forensic precision, international cooperation, and patience. None of those elements operate quickly. As for Zulma Guzman Castro, her situation remained unresolved publicly at the time of reporting. She remained subject to legal proceedings, and no final outcome had been announced. Authorities continued to stress that allegations do not equal guilt. The case had not yet reached its conclusion, but its impact was already clear. What began as a medical emergency had exposed a gap between assumption and reality. A crime that relied on silence, a method designed to look ordinary, and a delay that nearly allowed it to disappear. In the end, the consequences extended beyond one suspect or one investigation. They affected how people understood safety, and how easily harm can be hidden inside something as simple as fruit. This case was never about speed. It was about assumption. The assumption that food is safe, the assumption that illness is accidental, the assumption that harm announces itself clearly. In this case, it didn't. The act was small. The method was quiet. And for a moment, it blended into everyday life. If a single test had not been ordered, if a single question had not been asked, this story might never have become a crime story at all. That is what makes cases like this unsettling. Not the poison itself, but how easily it hid. Behind routine, behind trust, behind explanations that felt reasonable enough to accept. The investigation didn't succeed because of force or urgency. It succeeded because someone paused long enough to doubt what looked ordinary. And that pause made all the difference. Because sometimes, the most dangerous crimes are not the ones that shock us. They're the ones that almost pass unnoticed. If you stayed until the end, it means stories like this matter to you. This channel looks at crimes that don't rely on violence or chaos, but on silence, assumption, and delay. Cases where harm almost goes unnoticed, and where the truth depends on someone asking the right question at the right time. If you want more true crime stories told this way, you can subscribe to Behind the Perfect Crime. And if this case left you unsettled, consider why. Because sometimes, the most important part of justice is recognizing danger before it looks like one. They believed it was food poisoning,